Hi, everyone. So, last time we were talking about Kant's principle of universalizability. In this video, we're going to go a little bit deeper in talking about the connections in Kant between morality and rationality. So, in this presentation, we'll briefly review the principle of universalizability, and then we'll start diving into these questions about the relationship between morality and rationality. And we'll look at a famous problem that goes all the way back to Plato, what's known as the amoralist challenge. Then we'll introduce some technical machinery that Kant introduces between what he calls hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Then we'll introduce Kant's view that morality issues what he calls categorical imperatives. This will lead into his argument for the irrationality of immorality. So, remember, the principle of universalizability says an act is morally acceptable if and only if its maxim is universalizable. So, a maxim, remember, is the principle that underlies and guides our behavior. The principle says what we intend to do and why we intend to do it. Now, every action is going to have a maxim or principle guiding it. What makes an action morally acceptable is whether or not the maxim or that principle is morally acceptable. The good maxims are the ones that are universalizable. What it means for a maxim to be universalizable is that you could consistently commit yourself to a world where everybody supports and acts on that same principle or reasoning. So the idea there is you can rationally apply that principle to everyone without undermining the very action that principle is guiding. All right, so your maxims are not self-sabotaging in that way. That's the sense in which the maxims are consistent. So one important theme in Kant is this relationship between morality, our reason, and rationality. So I'll say a few things about this here. So remember, maxims are not just what we intend to do. It's not just our intentions. So you can't just say, well, my maxim is that I'm going to help this person. No, to explain the maxim guiding your behavior, you have to say that you're going to help this person, but you also have to say, well, why? Is it because they're your friend? Is it because they've asked you? What's the reason that's guiding your intention in that way? All right, now, our maxims are not causal principles that regulate our behavior, such as the instinctive principles that regulate animal behavior. So look, gravity is a principle of how things behave. There's also natural principles that guide how not just items behave, but how even animals, living things behave. So we can see this, for instance, when we look at Pavlov's dogs and the operant conditioning. The idea is a dog likes the food, they hear the bell ahead of time. So if you ring the bell over and over before you give them food, the idea is this will condition them so that there's a principle such that now when they hear the bell, they associate that with their minds associate that with the food. And so when they hear that bell, that gets them to behave. They are following a principle, but we can explain that principle purely in terms of operant conditioning. So humans are animals as well. And we too will have these instinctive principles that guide our behavior. I mean, we might be instinctively guided by pleasure. When we feel pleasure, we are thereby instinctively maybe motivated to get the thing that gives us that pleasure, for instance. But we can use our reason to evaluate those principles, and we can consider alternative principles. So even though just acting on our animal instincts, we might just eat all that delicious bacon or food. It is we could stop and think, well, okay, is that a good principle for me to be following? We can look at other principles that might guide our behavior, and we can assess not just the goodness or badness, but also the morality of those principles. And so we can then use our reason to reflect on the our instinctive principles guiding us, and we can think of other principles and use our reason to assess their goodness and morality, and then we can use that reason then to decide which principle we're going to choose to sort of guide us. So we could resist those animal instincts and act on different principles if we use our reason to decide to do that instead. Now, here's a question though. When we reason about morality, is it ever rational to behave immorally, to follow principles that we have used our reason to decide is not sort of moral? Kant believes that a person is always being irrational when they do something immoral. Now, this would be interesting because now when someone does something wrong, it's not just that we can say that they're doing something wrong, we can say that they're actually being irrational. The idea is we could use reason to show them that what they're doing is not, by their own sort of reason, they could sort of realize that what they're doing is not rational if they were to use their reason correctly. All right, now, to act irrationally is to act and reason badly. Now, if Kant is right, when we act immorally, we're reasoning poorly. But this seems a little bit strange. Can that really be right? Haven't we heard of lots of folks who act immorally while also being sharp, cunning, and strategic? In short, while being rational. That is, look, we can look at people who behave morally and we can distinguish between those that are rational and irrational. But similarly, when we look at people who behave immorally, some of them, yeah, they seem to be maybe idiots that are acting sort of foolishly as they act sort of immorally. So, I mean, the person who maybe commits murder, we can distinguish between the person who commits murder in a way that's just completely foolish, such that clearly they're going to get caught and go to jail because they're doing it in sort of broad daylight in front of everybody. But we can also distinguish that person from the rather sort of smart, thoughtful, careful, methodical person who acts immorally. And so that sort of intelligent person who sort of very carefully thinks about how they're going to do this immoral action so as to do everything possible so as to avoid maybe being caught or detection so that they can get exactly what they want. Well, is that person really being irrational? So now, this thinking leads to what's called the amoralist challenge. So this is a challenge that goes all the way back to sort of Plato. And the idea is, so an amoralist is not just someone who behaves immorally. It's a person who just doesn't care about morality. It's someone who says, yeah, I know this is wrong, but I just don't care that it's wrong. What I want is, imagine like the sort of contract killer who says, yeah, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but I just don't care that it's wrong. I just care about getting paid. I care about sort of doing whatever, and I'm going to think very carefully to make sure that I do this, I get paid a lot of money, and I don't get caught. So now, here's the challenge. It is rationality seems to be about doing what we have most reason to do. But someone might think, look, we only have reason to do things that are going to help us get what we want. Sometimes following our moral obligations just don't help us get anything we care about. For instance, again, that person who just doesn't care about morality. Yeah, doing the immoral thing is not going to help you be a more moral person, but the amoralist just doesn't care. And so being a moral person is not anything that they want to achieve. So it looks like sometimes maybe it can be rational to behave immorally. All right. So to try to respond to this amoralist challenge, to try to show that you have reason to be moral. Even the amoralist has a reason to be moral. Kant makes a distinction between two kinds of imperatives. So an imperative is a kind of command that a person can choose to follow or not follow. Now, rationality seems to be a matter of following the imperatives of reason. So we might think of as, look, reason gives us certain sort of commands that we can either do what reason metaphorically tells us to do, or we can disobey. We can choose not to do what reason tells us to do. And the idea is when we obey whatever it is that reason tells us to do, we're acting rationally. And then when we look at sort of what reasons we have, if we disobey what reason tells us to do, which we can choose to do, but we would just be acting irrationally, contrary to reason. So Kant, however, thought that there are two kinds of commands that reason can give. So there's basically, think, two sources where reasons might come from. Hypothetical imperatives are commands of reason that apply to us in virtue of the fact that it's a means to achieving a certain end we've adopted. In other words, hypothetical imperatives are reasons we have to do something because they're going to help us achieve a goal to which we've committed ourselves. So these kinds of reasons or imperatives have a kind of conditional form that say, if you have the goal X, then rationally you must do this action. So it doesn't just say, hey, look, you have reason to do this action. It says, if you have this goal, then you have a reason to do this action because doing the action will help you get to that goal. So consider the example of taking biology classes. So this is an action. Well, you might have hypothetical reasons or imperatives to take biology classes. If you have the goal of majoring in biology, then rationally you must take biology classes. That imperative or that reason applies to you if you have that relevant end or goal. If you have the goal of majoring in biology, then it would be irrational for you never to sign up for a biology class, because that's one of the paths. That's one of the things you have to do in order to get to that goal. It's a means to that end. But on the other hand, if you don't have the goal of majoring in biology, then it wouldn't necessarily be irrational for you to never sign up for a biology class. Now, unless, of course, it would be a means to other goals you might have. So maybe you have a goal of just knowing things about biology, even if you don't want to sort of major. Well, then taking a biology class might be a helpful way to achieve that goal. Or maybe your sort of other classes, or maybe your major, or maybe there's general distribution requirements that require you to take a certain biology class, and you want to get sort of a degree and that in something else, and that requires you to meet the general distribution requirements. Well, then again, that other goal might also thereby give you reason to take biology classes, since it's a means to that other goal as well. But the point here is, look, if you don't have the sort of goal major in biology, then you don't necessarily have that sort of reason to take biology classes either. All right. Now, the amoralist, so think back to the person who just doesn't care about morality. Well, they might be rational to the extent that they are still following hypothetical imperatives. They might still be reasoning well about the best way to achieve their own goals. So that reasoning might be flawless in that sense. So, I mean, yet again, I can distinguish between the criminal who doesn't care about morality and they're just sort of being stupid about it. They still don't want to go to jail, but they're sort of committing their crime in broad daylight in front of everybody. And the idea is, well, they're not doing a very good job at doing what they need to do in order to sort of avoid going to jail, in order to achieve their goal of getting away with the crime. But the criminal who doesn't care about morality, who's very careful and plans their sort of crime so as to avoid detection, well, they might be doing everything right so as to best achieve the goals that they do have. But Kant said there's other kinds of sort of imperatives that reason gives to us as well. They're what we might call categorical imperatives or reasons. So this is a command of reason that applies to a person unconditionally. So independently of the ends they have, or independently of what they do or do not care about. So Kant believed that moral obligations derived from a categorical imperative. Thus, he thought even if the amoralist is meeting all their hypothetical imperatives, they are irrational in the sense that they are violating the categorical imperative of morality. So morality requirements apply to us just because we are rational beings. We must obey them even if we don't want to, and even if moral obedience gets us nothing that we care about. And that makes morality objective. It applies to all rational creatures just because they have reason, independently of their beliefs or desires. So remember, Kant's reasons for rejecting the golden rule were that it made morality subjective. it depended upon, it said, sort of treat others the way you want to be treated. But that makes morality dependent upon what you desire. And so, on his view, if morality is issuing categorical imperatives, then it doesn't matter what you want. You still have reason to do the right thing, regardless of what your desires are. But how could one defend the claim that moral obligations are these categorical imperatives? Well, Kant thought that if the principle of universalizability is correct as a test of morality, then he could make the following case. Let's call it the argument for the irrationality of immorality. First premise. Well, if you're rational, then you're consistent. The idea is if you behave or reason inconsistently, then you're being irrational. So a person who believes that something is both true and false, well, their beliefs are inconsistent. And again, it doesn't matter if they want to be consistent or whether they care about consistency. So the person who believes that a table is both red and not red at the very same time, and I point out to them that those beliefs are inconsistent, they say, yeah, but I just don't care about inconsistency. They're still being irrational in that sort of way. All right, so rationality seems to require consistency. But that is, if you're consistent, then you obey the principle of universalizability. Because remember, the principle of universalizability was testing whether you could consistently apply your principles. If you obey the principle of universalizability, then you act morally, according to Kant. Thus, if you are rational, you act morally. Therefore, if you act immorally, then you're irrational, because yet again, you're breaking the principle of universalizability, and you are thereby acting inconsistently. All right, so there's a lot of things you could say about the first two premises, but it seems as if premise 3 is a pretty big one, since it says that the principle of universalizability is actually a good test of morality. Well, if it's possible to act consistently and to obey the principle of universalizability, but still act immorally, then this argument would fall apart. So the next video is where we'll assess whether the principle of universalizability really is a good test of morality. Like I said, if it's not, then it seems as if the previous argument fails to meet that amoralist challenge. See you then. Bye-bye.